Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Thank you to Haneen for meticulous organisation of this event. Thanks to Ted Goodliff for inviting me a while back to contribute to this RAI seminar series. And thank you, David, for sharing this webinar. So what I'm planning to do over the next 50 minutes or so is talk circle around this term spatial anthropology, and to explore how we might best approach it, understand it, and not in a way, I'm not attempting to in any way define this term. That's important to state at the outset. I'm trying to explore the kind of interdisciplinary underpinnings that shape what we can, in a larger sense, describe as spatial anthropology. So I'm kind of circling around that in a very loose, imprecise way. And along the way, what I'll be doing is dipping into some research I've done here in Liverpool and the Northwest more generally that kind of relates to some of the themes that I'll be touching upon. To illustrate the kind of key arguments or contentions that I'm making. So that's kind of the broad plan, but I should have shared my screen, so let me do that. There we are. So if all's going to plan, you should be seeing the title of this talk, which is Killing Space, Giving Life to Space, Interdisciplinary Excursions in Spatial Anthropology. So it's drawing on a book I wrote a few years ago called Spatial Anthropology, Excursions in Liminal Space. And the book, in a way, I guess, is a kind of consolidation exercise, in a way to try and find a term that in some way roughly approximates to various strands of research interests, approaches and methods that I've applied in my research. Again, I stress I'm not making any big claim for spatial anthropology. In one sense, in one important sense, I'm perhaps doing the opposite. I'm trying to dissolve it into a multiplicity of different approaches. So that's kind of the main aim of what I want to get across during the course of this talk. And the way I'm going to approach it is three central provocations, which are these. Space is a ball that bounces here and there. Spatial anthropology is not the same thing as the anthropology of space. Killing space is the dialectical precondition for the project of giving life to space. Okay, so those are the three provocations, and so I can keep an eye on my time. I will know I need to spend about 15 minutes or a bit more on each, and if I'm kind of way off in any of those, I'll know to keep on track so I don't go too much over. But let's start with the first, which is space is a ball that bounces here and there, and a nice graphic there to help us along our way, just in case you're struggling to imagine what a ball bouncing here and there might look like. Now, this phrase is actually taken from Shobo Genzo, it is Eihei Dogen, writing in the 13th century. He's a Japanese philosopher and is the founder of the Soto sect of Japanese Zen Buddhism. So what I'm doing with this provocation, this saying, space is a ball that bounces here and there, is using this as a way to kind of playfully toy with the idea of approaching space, whatever it is, as if it was a koan. Okay, so that's what I'm doing in this first part. Approaching something in the form of a koan. I'm sure you know all know what a koan is, but just by the way, brief description, explanation. This was a technique used in Zen Buddhism. Well, it still is obviously used in Zen Buddhism, mainly associated with the Rinzai sect of Zen Buddhism, but also used less so perhaps by the Soto sect. It's a kind of a tool, a mechanism designed to kind of break through rational processes of thinking. So it's can be a riddle, can be a saying, a phrase, a piece of text that the student is required not to explain or interpret or to, you know, publish some wonderful exegesis unpacking it all. That's not the point of it. It's to kind of break through a different form of insight understanding, okay? So beyond the kind of rational forms of how you might approach knowledge or an awareness and an understanding of the world. Now, I want to stress, this is really important, I am not seriously proposing koan as a kind of method, or I'm not applying Dogen's ideas in a way that I'm kind of citing him as a kind of theoretical, you know, point of reference that I'm drawing on. I'm perhaps misusing him rather than using him in this sense. But what I want to do with the idea of a koan is just to kind of prompt certain lines of thought. And these are really about the ungraspability of space, the impossibility of approaching it as an object, but rather to see it as a process or an intervention, and trying to square the kind of circle of maybe the paradox of the fact that to a certain extent space can only be known by stepping outside of it. Okay, so staying with this koan, let's just go straight to the Shoba Genzo, Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and just give an illustration of one of the how this koan around space is approached in there. And this is from a fascicle or chapter called Koku, which is translated as space. So soon to be Zen master Shigong talking to a student Zitan. Shigon asks Zitan, do you know how to grasp space? Zitan says, yes, I do. How do you grasp it? Zitan stroked the air with his hand. Shigong said, you don't know how to grasp space. Zitan responded, how do you grasp space, elder brother? Shigong poked his finger in Zitang's nostril and yanked his nose. Zitang grunted in pain and said, you're killing me. You're trying to pull off my nose. Shigong says, you can grasp it now. Okay. So I'm obviously not attempting to interpret that or explain that, just pull on certain maybe suggestive threads that come out of that. And it's to do with the graspability or the ungraspability of it. Maybe an interesting pedagogy involving actual bodily harm is not something to be encouraged. But nevertheless, it's probably something designed to force an awareness of the here and now. It's kind of a phenomenological resting of attention to the now, rather than pondering the question of how do you grasp space. The Zen master, I guess, is trying to say, you know, space is living it. You're in it. You're grasping it already. So don't grasp it. So in the this chapter Koku, which is all about space, what Dogen is doing and what he tends to do throughout Shoba Genzo is provide commentaries on well-established koans. So this is what he's doing here. So he's you know, responding as if in dialogue with his predecessor who's established this koan. So even if you have a good finger to grasp space, you should penetrate the inside and outside of space. You should kill space and give life to space. You should know the weight of space. Okay. So yeah, that doesn't make any sense in any kind of intelligible way, nor is it meant to. Okay. Although we can extrapolate from what's being said there, which is what I am doing, and which is in the title of the paper, which is you should kill space to give and give life to space. But you know, what exactly does that mean? Well, we're not approaching it in terms of knowing space in any sense of it being confined or molded into a kind of rational object of comprehension. Okay, it's not that. It's starting from the principle that we're trying to, you know, tap in or immerse ourselves in space in a way that we're not stepping out of it. So that's the kind of point I want to put across at this opening section of the talk. And yeah, you should know the weight of space. Okay, well, that's pretty nonsensical. You can't know the weight of space. What is suggestive? Well, what attracts me to this is its suggestiveness, its kind of unintelligibility, and its requirement that you don't try and understand this through rational means. Okay, there's a poetics of it. And it's trying to tap into that poetics of space, and how we might kind of start from there, really. This is kind of what I'm looking at. So the Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard, the phenomenologist, probably the most famous book, The Poetics of Space, he writes of the alveoli of space, which I really like. The countless alveoli of space, which contains compressed time. So again, he's talking very poetically about space, and there's a sense that you know what he's kind of inferring there. It's about the quality of space, the spaciousness of space, the breathability. So it's already trying to articulate a very embodied or lived sense of that space as it's encountered in the moment, in the phenomenological reception or embedding in that space is really what is coming through here. Okay, so leaping from Dogen to Henri Lefebvre, key theorist on space, obviously. So just picking up those threads of the ungraspability of space, this is what comes with that is a sense that there's a certain blindness, that you can't see it straight on, okay? Or you've got to see it obliquely through a kind of poetic means or through a koan. You can't rationally face it off and gain an understanding of it that way, okay? So coming at it from a completely different way, but talking on a similar vein of blindness, Henri Lefebvre is talking about this in his book, The Urban Revolution. The Urban Revolution was some of his earliest writings on space. This preceded his more famous work, The Production of Space, which came 4 years later. This Urban Revolution was published in 1970. Now he's talking about how difficult it is to kind of see the urban. There's a kind of blindness because there's different fields, between which different manifestations of the urban come to light. You can't see it head on. So just a quote from the Urban Revolution here to hopefully clarify that. Between fields, which are regions of force and conflict, there are blind fields. These are not merely dark and uncertain, poorly explored, but blind in the sense that there is a blind spot on the retina, the center, and negation of vision, a paradox. The eye doesn't see it, it needs a mirror. The center of vision doesn't see and doesn't know it's blind. So yeah, a certain blindness in terms of confronting head on how you might see the urban, how you might visualize it, how you might render it a intelligible object of knowledge. Okay, what Lefebvre doesn't do when he talks about fields, which I'm kind of more probably extrapolating on, is how we can apply this to disciplines. Okay, so the idea of there being blind blind fields between disciplines kind of makes sense in terms of how various different practitioners, people with different disciplinary backgrounds would confront and interrogate aspects of city life, the urban experience, these kinds of things. So there's a blindness, there's a blind spot between these fields. And it's only by kind of unpacking the sense that there's a dialectical field connecting these different ways of seeing the city that we kind of tap into how we should properly see the urban. And this is Lefebvre's kind of project as a dialectics of space. So we see it in this kind of second quote we have here. The urban is a highly complex field of tensions, of virtuality. Blindness consists in the fact that we cannot see the shape of the urban, the vectors and tensions inherent in this field, its logic and dialectical movement, its immanent demands. We see only things, operations, objects. Okay. So in other words, the urban or urban space is a ball bouncing here and there. We might arrest the image and see the ball in a particular configuration from a particular point of view, but we don't see the operation of the urban as a kind of dialectical movement, this complex field of tensions that Lefebvre is referring to. So this is what I'm trying to tap into and trying to see what a sense of this term spatial anthropology might make sense of this, tapping into this ball bouncing here and there. Okay, and just to illustrate this, and when these ideas first started to develop, I guess, was when I was working on a project here in Liverpool 15 years or so ago, 2006. It was 2 projects that ran back to back over 4 years. And what they were doing, these projects were looking at archive images of Liverpool, so lots of archival work, looking at different archive films, non-fiction, amateur films, actuality films that featured urban landscapes in Liverpool, recognisable urban landscapes, or even non-recognisable. I mean, that was what we was looking for. It was the city in film. And the object was to build a database to read these films spatially, to try and pull out information about the location, and also the different ways of how you might spatially interpret what's going on in a particular bit of footage. So we have kind of architectural readings that would be relating to the kind of landscape depicted in the films. It might be associated with housing, might be associated with commerce, or maritime areas and themes, things like that. But what we also was, what was happening in the bits of footage. Remember, these are actualities. This is kind of a lot of the interesting material that was most useful, certainly for me, was just films that showed everyday scenes. So, just everyday life scenes, festivals and parades. So what we're seeing here is not the kind of the space of the city as a design space. It's kind of architectural characterization, if you like. We're seeing it as a lived space, how these spaces are animated and brought alive by, the movements and activities of people in them. So what this project was, it was interdisciplinary in that we were working with architects. I mean, my background is film and cultural studies, and I did anthropology in my undergraduate degree. And what was interesting about this interdisciplinary approach to this phenomena, this question about the city in film is, how do you define the object? So this became something that I was kind of aware of early on, in that it was kind of raising this question of, what is the object of the city in film? But, because it's bringing out the sense that there are these blind spots between how different disciplinary backgrounds are kind of looking at what we're doing. So it wasn't just architects and film and cultural studies. We also, engaging with people in geography and civic design, popular music, who are doing similar things with music and space and urban landscape. So there was a kind of melting pot of different kind of background subject areas. And what became really interesting for me was identifying those points where, there was a kind of, not a conflict, but certain tensions that arose between how the city in film, what it is, how we might understand it, is being approached from different disciplinary backgrounds. So this made sense in terms of these blind fields that Lefebvre is talking about. So this question, what is the object of the city in film, in a sense, can be almost like a koan, in a sense that you should perhaps not seek to answer it, because it should always be elusive, because it's something that inhabits a multiplicity of different spaces, different practices. It involves architectural or design space. It brings us into contact with lived space, what Merleau-Ponty and Michel de Certeau after him called anthropological space. We have everyday practices, events, festivals, and then we have the city in film. So as it's actually represented through the cinematic medium. So another space, the imaginaries, the kind of urban imaginaries that some of these practices and these film texts are drawing on, but also contributing to, all of that comes into the fray. And as we develop the project in a later part, which involved ethnographic work with some of the filmmakers whose material we were looking at, we open up another kind of level and context, the meaning that's feeding into understandings of the city as it's, you know, a product of a variety of different interventions, film practices, spatial practices. So he's doing interviews, doing ethnographic work with, for example, amateur film clubs. And what you see here is gentlemen from the Swan Movie Makers, based in the Wirral, used to be called the Swan Cine Club. They've been going since the 1950s. And a lot of the really interesting films that I gravitated towards that they were making were of kind of everyday scenes, of things that kind of spoke about their life. Things like commuting journeys over the River Mersey on the ferry. There was another film where they were tracking the movements of someone going to work from the Wirral to across the water to Liverpool by car and someone else by train. So they were kind of mapping kind of these little intricate social geographies of mobility in everyday life. You know, that it was part of their life, their habitus, but it's also memorializing these kind of lived spaces, this kind of otherwise lost part of the city, which is the city as it's been lived, not just as it's been documented through maps, these more abstract designs about how we might understand the city of the past. Okay, so to jump back quickly then to Dogen, if we can do such a precipitous leap. We come at this question of a paradox, which I mentioned before, the paradox of space being something that, you know, to a certain extent you have to step outside of in order to fully visualize or apprehend, and, you know, then questioning that process, really. So from Dogen, this idea of a paradox is being commented on here by the philosopher J. Garfield. He's not talking about the paradox of space per se, but the same applies in terms of what he's saying about Dogen. So I'll read this. The trick to living with this paradox, Dogen urges, is to work to drop the habit of objectification, of reification, and to work towards a radically different subjectivity, one of participation in manifestation that takes one beyond experiencing oneself as a subject standing over against an object. It is, in fact, a transformation that dispenses with things as objects of experience. Okay, so we arrive at the importance of experience, and the fact that in order to know space, you've got to be in it, you've got to be experiencing it, and to inhibit as far as possible any maneuverings or any kind of means by which you are forced to step outside of it. Okay, that stops the ball bouncing around. Okay, all right, that's enough of koans and balls bouncing around. At this point, I'm going to move on to the next provocation, which is spatial anthropology is not the same thing as the anthropology of space. Now, what I'm getting at here is that, and again, I reiterate what I said before, I'm not seeking to define some clear terrain by which we might understand this thing, spatial anthropology. It's not necessarily even anthropological in a disciplinary sense, which I'll go on to talk about in a moment. So it's not necessarily something that is within the disciplinary purview of anthropology itself. There's, you know, I mean, there's some key texts and classic works that we could cite in relation to the anthropology of place, space, and landscape. Cephalo, Lawrence Zuniga's work, Hirsch and O'Halloran, Coleman and Collins, Barbara Bender's work on landscape, Marc Auger, who I'll come on to in a while, or you know, Bourdieu's work on the Kabyle House. These are all kind of really at the centre of anthropological perspectives and discussions around questions of space, place, and landscape. But I guess there's another sense that maybe, you know, all anthropology is spatial anthropology in as much as it's concerned with a field site and field work. You know, you immerse yourself in a space, in a field, or you know, whatever form that takes. So this is, what Coleman and Collins are talking about, locating the field. Now, the field might be a lot more challenging in the digital age, but it's nevertheless, there are spaces that are being inhabited in anthropological work. So again, just the idea of the anthropology of space or spatial anthropology. Surely anthropology, by its very essence and what it is, has space and spatiality, written into it right from the very, its groundings upwards, I would say. Which I realise is probably not very helpful if we're trying to delineate something around spatial anthropology, which what this talk is about. But then I guess that's the point. I don't want to precisely just pin it down and say this is that and that is there. I want to keep it open and maybe a bit diffuse. But what I really want to focus on in this section with this provocation is that how spatial anthropology, how I've kind of interpreted it and applied it and drawn on it, it's not really come from anthropology at all. It's come from a variety of other sources that may have little or no affiliation or connection with anthropology or the work of anthropologists. So the term spatial anthropology itself is most explicitly used by architects. So if you go and Google Scholar and put those words in, I mean, I will come up. I'm not an architect, I should point that out. But the other stuff that you'll get is by architects. Okay. And when I first came across this term, it was from this book, Tokyo Spatial Anthropology, Eihei Dogen. At the time, I was undergraduate with a keen interest in Tokyo and ethnographies of Tokyo. And I remember looking at this book and finding it deeply disappointing because it wasn't very anthropological. I've since come back to it, 20 years on, and I'll say about that in a moment. But yeah, this is a term that was used by Eihei Dogen, who's an architectural historian. Okay, so this is what he says in the early parts of the book. I ventured to include the odd-sounding phrase spatial anthropology in my title. I believe that my method, placing oneself within the urban space of contemporary Tokyo, replete with the meanings and memories that are the accumulation of human activities, conducting surveys of the field, and applying a comparative perspective to elucidate the special structure of the city, does in fact constitute an anthropological approach. So the kind of things he was aiming to do would be to kind of pull out Edo, the old Tokyo, prior to 1868. So he would use maps of Edo to navigate his way around modern Tokyo. Not just him, he'll get his students involved with this as well. So this isn't in the book, this is just a map of Edo that I pulled up myself. But in terms of how we might read that map, what's legible about it, we can see the blue. It's a city where water and access to the city via waterways seems very prominent. Okay, but what else was being done here? He was looking at paintings, ukiyo-e. These are the woodblock prints and paintings of the floating world. Ukiyo-e translates the pictures of the floating world. Very famous figures like Hokusai at Hiroshige. And a lot of these depict just people milling through the streets, quite often in the leisure quarters, theatre, cafe, brothel, but just the sheer kind of dynamism and vibrancy of the city streets as they're lived and populated through these kind of captures in art. I don't know how clearly you can see it on this image, but you've just got a teeming kind of sea of people here going over the bridge, just the kind of sea of humanity there. But anyway, this is from the book where Hidenobu is directly referring to this image. He says, "We see crowds crossing the bridge on their way to the theatre. This movement across space of being drawn through the water by boat or across the bridge on foot to the entertainment district with its forest of banners and booming drum must have added to the anticipation of the eager playgoers. Here, nearly all the human senses, sight, sound, touch, and taste come into play. Performative space, an extraordinary fiction where the populace gathered in search of a sense of liberation, was thus associated with water and developed in an atmosphere that was both festal and emotive. So what Jinai is doing is kind of using cultural texts, including maps, paintings, ukiyo, like we see here, and trying to use these kind of almost as ethnographic sources to help him kind of paint a fuller picture of the historical anthropology of Edo and its kind of key sites as lived spaces. He's trying to kind of populate what would otherwise be an empty, barren map that just kind of lays out the locations of the city. You know, what's lacking there is the lived, performative. He uses this term, performative space. And he also, he's stressing the importance of the senses, the sight, sound, touch, and taste. And a lot of that's through his imaginative work. He's imagining himself into that space because he can't travel back in time, obviously. But nevertheless, he's coming at it from someone who's trying to pull from that in a way that, he's trying to resonate, find a resonant point of connection with how these spaces might have been experienced back in the day, 150 or whatever it was years before. But importantly, he's not just reading these as texts. He's actually using this to kind of stir up his own kind of imaginative sense of this world, of the past, these spaces. And he's carrying it with him into the modern day landscapes of Tokyo today. So, and that's a crucial part of what he's doing. So it's placing himself in the actual urban landscape, but with an awareness of these this performativity, these kind of spectral memories of city life and the emotional kind of resonances that govern these places as they were back in the day. So he's trying to pull the old city out from under the asphalt of the new, if you like. So what I came to realize, looking back at this book 20 years on, after I'd started work with others on the City and Film project, is I realized that it's very similar to actually what we were doing on the City and Film project. Well, similar in some ways, but very, very different in others, obviously. Here's just another of the paintings. This is Hiroshige. You get a bit more of a clearer view in that one. But yeah, so this is where the term spatial anthropology, what I took from Jinai and his work on Tokyo, which seemed to make sense. Because what I and others were doing were taking, these archive films, almost as kind of forms of ethnographic text, and using them as part of a way of entering that imaginative space of a city that is defined now by absence. Okay, large parts of what we saw in these archive films relate to a city that's being completely transformed. Although interestingly, not so in this one, what you're seeing here. This is a film called The Pool of Life, which is actually shot over 2 years, but it purports to be a day in the life. So it's a fiction in that sense, but as no less true for that. It's just everyday scenes. That space is still there, Williamson Square, but it's very, very different today. It's more akin to what Marc Auger would call a non-place. It's just a place that people pass through. It's not a place where people would inhabit in any meaningful sense. So these films became really useful tools to try and get a sense of the lived spaces of parts of Liverpool. And that then has a very contemporary resonance in terms of decisions made about the city today, and what's lacking, and what could be different, and things like that. So it's not just an exercise in nostalgia and cultural memory for its own sake. It's also, drawing this directly into, contemporary relevance in terms of how it might create a dialogue between past and present. So yes, one of the curious things about the book Tokyo, A Spatial Anthropology, is how much it insulates itself from kind of wider discourse, kind of urbanism, urban space, and things like that. which is certainly a very problematic aspect of the book, and you know, something that we could critique, and it's a shortcoming. But you know, essentially, I mean, it's amazing that he doesn't mention the work of Kevin Lynch, because that's essentially what Jinai Hidenobu is trying to do in that Tokyo project. So Kevin Lynch is an urban planner, environmental psychologist, very influential book published in 1960 called The Image of the City. And that was all about urban cognitive mapping, how we learn the process of wayfinding. This is wayfinding differently from how Tim Ingold or someone like that might be using it. It's a cognitive process, how we mentally compute our bearings in relation to the environment around us. And Kevin Lynch came up with these 5 elements: edges, nodes, landmarks, districts, and paths. And try these out, these really do work. I guarantee you will find these do work. So, you know, how you're orientating yourself through the city and how you might be learning to read that city by this process of cognitive mapping is anthropological in the sense that it's premised on the person. It's humanizing of that space, the city experience from the point of view of a person experiencing the city, not from a map, or you know, how much cognitive mapping goes on now when people just follow a blue dot on Google Maps. I don't know. It kind of raises these questions. But what in the Tokyo book is he's trying to make legible. So it's this term legibility. So we read cities by finding ways of making them legible. We read them in different ways. And that can just as much apply to the past as it can to the cities that we find our way and learn our way around today. So, so this question of legibility seemed very important. So Kevin Lynch, again, I'm not an anthropologist like Jinai Hidenobu is not an anthropologist, but you know, he's developing something which, you know, you could apply the term spatial anthropology to. And Lynch does draw on anthropological sources, but in a kind of a bit of an odd way, given that so much of his focus is on cities and urban environments. He draws on like Malinowski, for example, tall groves rising out of jungle bush to indicate villages or sacred sites to the Trobrianders. So he gets that from Malinowski and says, ah, right, yeah, that's their wayfinding. That's how they're cognitively mapping their environment. So he's taking from this and extrapolating to some kind of universal sense of how, you know, humans find their way around their environments. I don't know, there's much could be said about Lynch, much could be criticized about Lynch. It's very kind of romanticized, Rousseau-esque way of approaching, you know, these questions. But yeah, it's the term legibility. How do we read cities? So that's an important factor, okay? And an associated term, which is imageability, okay? And that certainly resonates. You know, cities today are all about imageability. They need to scream recognizability, some visual image, almost like a visual reference point. You know, here in Liverpool a few years ago, it was the lamb banana, big ugly yellow statue thing. Or, you know, a key landmark building or something like that. Imageability, legibility, these kinds of things. Which brings me on to psychogeography, which is a bit of again, another leap. My segue into psychogeography is through the work of the critical cartographer Dennis Wood. Dennis Wood in 2010 wrote a paper called something like The Two Psychogeographies. And what he was doing in that paper was exploring the commonalities between sort of work that environmental psychologists like Kevin Lynch were doing in Image of the City, and more radical forms of urban exploration, urban spatial praxis, which you get with the situationists and the development of psychogeography as it came out of the situationists. So I think, yeah, Dennis Wood makes some interesting points here. I mean, on a superficial level, they're very, very different. You know, Guy Debord, the situationists, and Kevin Lynch. But there's a shared sense to they're both about humanizing space. They're both about, you know, concerned with aesthetics above functionalism and the technocratic elements of cities, and a focus on the quality of human experience. So yeah, we come at psychogeography, and I really don't want to get sidetracked into this, because how it's defined and squabbles between different groups and factions within psychogeography is not something I find particularly interesting, and I don't want to get drawn into here. But I just wanted to, again, as another example of something that falls under this broader catchment of spatial anthropology, this is what's going on in psychogeography. So a few quotes. Here's from Guy Debord, from Introduction to a Critique of Urban Geography. Psychogeography will aim to study the precise laws and special effects of the geographic milieu, consciously planned or not, acting directly on the effective comportment of individuals and the degree of their influence on human feelings. Okay, so talking about atmosphere, ambience, the qualities of a place and how that might affect the human experience of being in that place or space. And by extension, how through artistic or political or radical forms of intervention, you can reimagine that place or space. So psychogeography as something that opens the possibility of creating a different way of thinking about and experiencing space, urban space. We might come at it through someone like Ian Sinclair, writer who's very much associated with the psychogeography label. In Lights Out for the Territory, he defines kind of the derive, which is kind of a drift through the city, which is a thing from psychogeography. Drifting purposely is the recommended mode, tramping asphalted earth in alert reverie, allowing the fiction of an underlying pattern to reveal itself. Okay, so again, with this, you get a sense of trying to pull out from what's not visible, maybe buried, that's hidden, or tap into a different kind of atmosphere or sensibility that being there kind of enables through a creative or immersive kind of intervention in that space, which is, the stuff of what makes, what gives Ian Sinclair the subject matter for most of the stuff that he writes. Or this from Michael Sheringham, talking about archiving, the idea of the city itself as being an archive. Now this I found really, really useful. So the archival in all its materiality, its layeredness, its endless transformations, is a dimension that cities have in common, and that we access by consenting to let go of our familiar reference points in personal and collective space and time and space, sorry. Okay, that's the last bit that's the key there, consenting to let go of our familiar reference points. So again, allowing some other experience or atmosphere to kind of creep in, to seep up, and to allow you to see and experience that city in a different way. You're kind of tapping in. So this is, I guess, what Eihei Dogen is trying to do. He's trying to tap into Edo, trying to shake off the modern city and tap in to the Edo city that preceded him. Okay, so there's much more could be said about psychogeography, but I'll keep an eye on time. Deep mapping, another kind of label term. I mean, I published on this a few years ago, mainly out of interest to see how different people from different backgrounds were approaching what deep mapping was, which went from all the way from, people geospatial computing, creating kind of big data models of a map that could feed from endless amounts of data on one end, through to artists or theatrical interventions in a place, which also was being described as deep mapping. So I was interested to explore exactly what the commonalities or not was between these different approaches to deep mapping. I won't go through all of these, but in the introduction article I wrote to this, I was trying to pull together some kind of common factors. Concern with spatial storytelling, thick description, a strongly performative dimension, time-based cartographics, an open and processual spatial sensibility, this kind of thing. So I was, some are doing this more than others, but what seemed common ground in what they were all doing was really a kind of multimodal ethnography, pulling from, the new resources that digital technologies provide, and digital map and go beyond just the surface layer of the two-dimensional map and kind of plow the depth through what can be done through either immersive forms of site-specific engagement or what can be done through enhancing and tapping into digital resources and the creation of a deep map. Now, the point I was getting at when I was kind of looking and surveying all these developments around deep mapping is, you know, is drawing the conclusion that, yeah, it doesn't matter what you call all this stuff. I'm just pleased and delighted that this stuff is happening at all. You know, to me, it kind of, there's a continuum with what I'm understanding as spatial anthropology to what all you guys are doing. You know, let's not get hung up on labels type thing. You know, they might see it differently. I don't know, people who subscribe strongly to the deep mapping method, I don't know. But again, it's just another example of a kind of cluster of perspectives and approaches that seem to have a very strong kind of anthropological resonance to what they're doing, or ethnographic underpinnings to what they're doing, an immersive sense of being in that space, not separating yourself from it. And lastly, I won't say too much about this. I mean, developments in geography, non-representational, or what I think some now insist on calling more than representational geography. Neither term, I think, really does much for me, if I'm being honest. But we have something like this from Nigel Thrift, who's defining non-representational theory as about the geography of what happens, what is present in experience. Okay. If you think about that, there's a lot that's covered in that definition. And when you look at you know, what more Nigel Thrift is saying, he's talking about, you know, he mentions some main tenets of non-representational geography: radical empiricist epistemologies. Okay, well, that makes me think of the work of the anthropologist Michael Jackson, a book like Paths Towards a Clearing, Radical Empiricism and Ethnographic Inquiry. But hey, yeah, the on-flow and flux of everyday life, corporeality, affect and the senses, performance and play, and attentiveness to practices. Okay, yeah, you get the sense of, you know, where they're coming from with that, and how much of that shares much common ground with kind of anthropology, particularly phenomenological traditions of anthropology as they've developed through the work of people like Michael Jackson and others. So my aim is not to deny or downplay the specificity of any of these subject areas, but to draw out some of the common threads that run through all of them. And that is, you know, there's essentially anthropological dispositions and sensibilities that they're each kind of reaching for or exhibiting in some shape or form. Okay, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll maybe cut short slightly this last provocation. So this brings me to the third and final provocation, which is killing space is the dialectical precondition for the project of giving life to space. Okay. Now, anyone who's familiar with my work or has read some of it will know that Tim Ingold pops up a lot. His work is something I draw on a lot and find very inspiring. What he's written about wayfinding and dwelling, and you know, that broadly phenomenological approach and disposition towards, you know, the everyday spaces and places we inhabit. But there's something I can't agree on in terms of something he's written about space, which is in the article that he wrote prior to, it was published in this book Being Alive, but it was a journal article a few years beforehand, which is called Against Space. Of all the terms we use to describe the world we inhabit, space is the most abstract, the most empty, the most detached from the realities of life and experience. Space is nothing, and because it is nothing, it cannot truly be inhabited at all. Wow, okay. Yeah, I just can't agree with that, I'm sorry. But yeah, so, you know, how is he and why is he coming at it in that way? Okay. It's interesting, and he mentions it himself in the book Being Alive, that, you know, a couple of years before, the geographer Doreen Massey wrote a book called For Space. So we have one against space and one for space. And this is what Doreen Massey says in that book: space is always in the process of being made. It is never finished, never closed. Perhaps we could imagine space as a simultaneity of stories so far, which I rather like. That makes sense in terms of this deep mapping that I just mentioned. Simultaneity, stories just accrue choral-like in the spaces and places that how time accumulates within space. Okay, so I can relate to what Dorian Massey's saying there, but I have problems with what Tim Ingold is saying there. So I won't dwell too much on non-places, Mark Auger, because I know this is kind of quite well established now, but this seems to be kind of relevant in this context, in as much as what Auger is looking at in this idea of the non-place is a sense of the abstract, the nothingness, the emptiness that maybe Tim Ingold is striving at. So yeah, Auger is talking about transit spaces, you know, airports, motorways, border zones, all sorts of kind of transitory spaces that he argues that are empty of history, identity, you know, memory. There's nothing to anchor memory. So these are processual kind of spaces. And I've just got, you know, some artistic responses or literary responses there from J.G. Ballard, who seems to be, a lot of his work plows Auger territory. Sinclair, who I've already mentioned, did a long walk around the M25 and wrote that in London Orbital. Or in film, many examples from film, but this one from Chantal Ackerman, which is pretty much the whole thing takes place in non-places. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's a limit. There's limitations to what Auger is doing in terms of how he's going about the task of understanding or analysing, studying these places. He says, you know, try to imagine a Durkheimian analysis of a transit lounge at Roissy. Okay, well, I have a, you know, response to that. Try instead to imagine a phenomenological anthropology or autoethnographic analysis of a transit lounge at Roissy, and you have a more productive set of tools and frameworks to then embark on that task. I think Auger can only go so far in that process. So what I'm saying is, for Auger, the non-place is a negation of what he calls anthropological place. A non-place, he says it himself, it's not necessarily an absolute, there's always a continuum. It's not like any place is completely negated or any, you know, a non-place is not fully a non-place, there's always gradations. But it's defined against what he's understanding as anthropological space, anthropological place, sorry. Which is a Durkheimian sense of a bounded space, a kind of common set of meanings, histories, culture, identity, these kind of things. But what I'm adding to the mix here is the negation of place, okay? And this is really what, you know, writers like Sinclair, maybe J.G. Ballard, artists more generally who are working, and there's a lot of, you know, really interesting work done on non-places as sources of inspiration. You're seeking negation of the negation of place. You kind of, it's the hardest place possible to try and turn it around, to imagine it something that has meaning and, you know, human connectivity and memory and all these kinds of things. So this was the starting point of a kind of, you know, a bit of guerrilla ethnography, I don't know what you want to call it, which involved me casting myself away on a desert, not a desert island, a concrete island in the middle of the M53 motorway, which is the mid-Wirral motorway that runs up the centre of the Wirral. So, which is very familiar for me because I live in Wales, so I drive up the motorway to get to work in Liverpool. And I've gone past this curious traffic island many, hundreds of times. It's always intrigued me. So I decided one day, right, you know, I would spend a day and a night on there. Don't ask me why. It was just something that I felt should be done. And, you know, so there wasn't a kind of set aim or objective to that. You know, I wouldn't dignify it as a project. Perhaps I could, I don't know. But it was kind of an autoethnographic experiment of kind of radical placelessness. So this is what I did. So what you can see in this, this diagram here, you know, at some point back in 1970s, I think, the plan was to extend the M53 motorway down towards Wales, which would have been great for me because my work commute would have been that much quicker. But they abandoned it. But they'd started some of the construction. Oops, sorry, leaped ahead. They've started some of the construction, but they abandoned it. So you've got this huge, quite large piece of land, which became obsolete. So the motorway molded itself around it. So I guess it's a non-place in that sense. I prefer the term negative space because it only exists by virtue of the fact that it's there as a kind of, it falls between the gaps of what otherwise is there, which is the motorway, the northbound and southbound motorway. Anyway, I spent some time there. I deliberately, plonked myself on the island to kind of explore it, to do some digital gleaning, which was making tracking. So using an array of digital devices, tracking my way around the island with GPS tracking, taking video, photos, taking audio soundscapes, things like that. Just gathering all of this kind of evidence, if you like, from the island and taking it back with me afterwards to kind of make sense of or make space, because that's really what was going on. The space itself only exists to the extent that I'm talking about it, other than a negative space. If we can see it as an anthropological space, it's through what I'm doing in placing myself there and treating it as a space that I am connected with embodiedly. My phenomenological presence is felt through my entanglements with what that space is and what constructs it. And a lot of it is about time, rhythm, just the sheer relentless flow of traffic, things like that. So just quickly on this, and I'll wrap up in a moment. We have some of these tracks that I took from my maneuvers and movements around the island. We get some parts where there's kind of large spikes, which intrigue me. So the bits where there's just kind of lines, wobbly lines, that's kind of where I'm actively involved in something. So I'm going from A to B, I'm exploring the island. The bits where I'm stationary, I'm camping or sitting there, is where these kind of anomalies are, where the signal drops out, or the centrifugal force of the motorway is doing strange things to the GPS. But in a way, it kind of makes sense because, at those moments when I'm not active, when I'm not engaged in what Ingold would call a taskscape, I am, a plethora of, thoughts and sensations that I become more aware of through my stillness and my presentness in that space. So this kind of made sense in that, from that perspective, but otherwise it's just a kind of technological clip. So anyway, to cut that short, it's placemaking through an immersion in a performative space. Okay, it's space that I'm making through my performative immersion in that space, and I'm making space through that. So I'm converting a negative space into something. I don't know what, but something. Okay, it's a negation of place or space. So to come back to Ingold, so it's not against space. Yes, that space is abstract up to a point. It's abstract on a map. It's abstract in terms of its configuration as part of the motorway network. But space itself is intrinsically not just abstract and empty. It can be something so much more. You can inhabit it in different ways, and through that, make something more of it. Use that creatively and productively. So I think that's probably the point I should end. And I'll just end by repeating the 3 provocations, which is space is a ball that bounces here and there. Spatial anthropology is not the same thing as the anthropology of space, and killing space is the dialectical precondition for the project of giving life to space. Thank you very much for listening, and sorry if I overran a little slightly there. But yeah, happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you very much. I do apologise that I had a complete technological outage at the beginning. So feel free, please, to use time now if you wish to answering the questions in full. And so do just send in your questions to the chat. I can see that there are 3 there already. So why don't we start with those? And also, if you raise your hand, you can ask your question live. So
David, we
go
can't.
to,
Now we can see you.
hello.
We can see
Yes,
you
yeah.
now again. Wonderful.
Splendid, splendid. Well, I'm delighted to hear it. So why don't we take the questions in turn first of all? So the ones that have been sent in. So Sangeeta Bhagagupta says multiversal thinking would call for interrogating the unintelligibility issue you discuss in terms of from whom's gaze. Could you please comment? I wasn't completely clear about the question, but perhaps you are, or you got it in front of you, you can have a wee look.
Multiverse thinking would call for interrogating the unintelligibility issue you discuss in terms of from who's gaze. Okay, that'll be helpful if that question was expanded. I don't know if we can, if the questioner is happy to put that question directly and expand on what I said there. Is that
yes, Sangeeta, if it's handy, then do feel free to put your hand up, and then we can take.
I don't think she's going to do that because she also wrote another message saying she will not be able to stay for the entire webinar. So she will hope to find the response in the recording later. So sadly, we can't.
All right, that's okay. I'll from what she's put there in the chat, I'll attempt something based on that. It could benefit from being expanded a bit though. The unintelligibility of space that I was talking about, I guess, is what she's picking up on there, and from whose gaze. If I'm interpreting the question correctly, from whose gaze is the key point, really. I'm not saying that space is unintelligible per se. It's made intelligible through the specific interventions of those who are bringing their own way of thinking, their epistemological structures of how they're thinking about space, how they're placing themselves in relation to any given space that they're talking about, or building into fields and bodies of knowledge. So from whose gaze is, I take that as rhetorical. It's not just a way of dipping out the question. But yeah, it's highlighting the extent to which, when we're thinking about space and how we understand it, and how we're standing apart from it, which is what we do as academics, in order to kind of place it there and talk about it and point to it and say, unpack it, if you like. That's done in different ways. An artist would do it differently from an urban planner or from an architect. An anthropologist, I'm not just being maybe biased here, but perhaps would seek a more holistic way of trying to tap into the different ways and configurations, how different gazes upon that space, how different ways of making it intelligible come together. And they don't always come together. This is the blind fields point that Lefebvre's making. We think there's this intelligible central object called the urban that everyone can relate to, and it's just commonsensical. No matter who you are, you can engage in. But no, there's a whole, force field of tensions and dialectical positions that need unpacking. So the question of whose gaze is I agree. It's a necessary question to ask before you're kind of posing the question of what space, how, what is my relationship to any given space? How can I know that space as an object of knowledge? And what is my kind of ethical or disciplinary or anti-disciplinary stance towards how I'm talking about space? I don't know if that answered it. If she's not here, we'll never know, but I gave it my best shot.
She might write to you afterwards, which is always easy to facilitate. But I see that Jonathan's. Good afternoon, Jonathan. Jonathan Skinner, by the way. It's very nice to see you as always, if virtually. But I see you've got 3 comments here. Do you want to go live, as it were, and talk? All you need to do, I think, is to press your raise hand function, then we can go live with you. But whilst Jonathan's thinking about that, would you like to?
He has raised his hand, so I'm going to.
He has raised his hand.
Yes.
Oh, great! Can you facilitate him then?
Yeah.
Because I can't hear for some reason.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Jonathan.
Yes,
Hello,
we can
John.
hear you.
Go ahead, Jonathan. Nice to hear you. Please, the floor is yours.
I know. Thank you. It's great to sort of see Yeah, see old faces. Not old friends. I really enjoyed the talk, and provocative as ever. It's really interesting that some of my colleagues are working on Tokyo in terms of the Olympics. So it's really interesting comparisons with the idea of the festival city, and I really like the sort of the metaphor with the sort of the forest of drums and banners. And I hope you won't mind a couple of tweets as we went along. I wanted to sort of try and link to your other work, because I've engaged more with that, and I'm probably more comfortable. Like this was new thinking, and I'm still sort of absorbing. Okay. But you have a great paper with Hazel on interdisciplinarity, and interdisciplinarity sort of featured in the title, so I suppose there's some justification for bringing it in. But it's about, you have this concept of striations, sort of between disciplines, and I wondered about if striations had any connection to the space, and this sort of production of space. That was where I was coming from. The other were just flippant comments about Aberdeen and space with Ingold.
Okay, well, no, go with them, and then I'll answer your first question. Let's have the flippant comments.
Oh, that was the flippant comment. I was just like, I just.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, well, I think it is about boundaries, and I don't know whether for accident or design. I've always, and it's sometimes been counterproductive, seen someone who's kind of squatted or found a space between disciplines. And I found that quite often can be a very productive space to be. So I'm, even now I'm talking about it as a space. But it is, to a certain extent. There are these boundaries, and they're sometimes frustratingly very heavily policed. Some disciplines more than others. I won't say too much more than that. But there are boundaries. There are, certain structures that make those boundaries more rarefied. Things like ref panels and where your work goes to, and whose background it is that's signing off on what you're saying about this, and these kind of things. I mean, interdisciplinarity is a nice buzzword. It's always kind of thrown out, as a nice cozy word that everyone should be taking their hat off to. But I mean, the seriously radical implications of interdisciplinarity, I don't think really are generally taken up, because it's raising uncomfortable questions. It pulls people out of their comfort zone, and I think that can be a good thing.
This is where, I mean, quite often you sort of think of the cozy sort of Venn diagram and overlapping, or sort of, was it Frederick Barth's sort of ethnic boundaries and sort of circles and what's contained in them and where the borders are. But this is where I think the striations and the cleavages, the sort of more geographical type of metaphor is provocative in itself, and useful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the striations, but perhaps I wouldn't use that. I mean, I'll come back to Ingold again, even though I've kind of voicing off against his notion of space. But the term meshwork, which he, I think he lists from Henri Lefebvre. But that kind of makes sense, because there's a lot of meshwork. There's a lot of kind of knotting of different perspectives, disciplinary kind of trajectories and stuff that takes place in these, the Venn diagram common area bit that you mentioned, and that they can be really exciting, and they can be really, really productive. They can be frustrating as well, and they don't go anywhere. They just become dead, fallow ground. But the idea of a meshwork of just pulling up, from what otherwise quite complex array of different ideas, and making them work in some way, seems fundamentally premised on going beyond just that cozy sense of, this is my discipline and this is where I hang out. I really have not got much time for that at all, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you.
Did you want to say any more, Jonathan, or was that your?
No. I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, that was really, really great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, Alex Pellin has a question here. Hello, Alex. And she says her battery's running out, so why don't we take her question quickly? And she says, what comes to mind is Robert Rominson's deconstruction of 15th century linear perspective and European vision in his Technology as Dream and Symptom. In addition, I wonder how his more recent monograph, The Wounded Researcher, could interact with your research practice.
Right, I can't see that question on the chat.
It's at the bottom of the questions in the Q&A.
Ah, right. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing.
Actually, if you can hear me, I can qualify it.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Alex. Yes, nice to hear from you.
Yeah, so I wouldn't have been able to answer that question. I'm sorry, but please.
No, I'm just kind of wondering, I mean, it's the issue of the chicken and the egg. And since you mentioned Michael Jackson's work, Path Towards the Clearing,
Yeah.
I kind of wonder whether we couldn't that subject it to a more wider cultural analysis. And his piece being from the 80s, with this big question of what does it mean if you live in a society in a dense rainforest where there's no conception of horizon? So what does it mean that you cannot leave the place to get a sense of space, or the concept of horizon does not feature within your cognitive map? And that is a question I think is very linked to Stephen Feld's analysis about the Kaluli in New Guinea, who live in very similar dense rainforest environments, where there isn't necessarily a notion of silence. And so then he asks, well, how, if you don't live in an environment where there's silence, which is actually very comparable to living in an environment without horizon, is that sort of abstract nothingness, which could be spatial, which could be acoustic. And so Stephen Feld has argued, well, we could imagine musical traditions without silence. But the problem is that our musical tradition has silence. We have these kind of moments of contemplation, etc. Much like we have linear perspective, like which very much features in the work of Robert Ramanujan, a sort of feature of our own life world since the 15th century. So my question is, how do you extricate yourself from that kind of intuitive understanding of a horizon line or of silence? Despite our phenomenology, I think it's very important to have a radical anthropology in mind, where the limits of deconstruction feature within research practices.
Okay, that's probably a harder question to answer, but I mean, it's an important one because, yeah, I mean, if there is no conception of a horizon and you're introducing that to your analysis, then you're doing a form of symbolic violence to the thing that you're studying, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at there? Is that you're introducing something that's alien to it?
Yes, and then the question is, can we subtract it from our experience?
That's a good question. Probably to a certain extent, we can't, if that's part of how we intuitively have adjusted. This is the cognitive mapping thing. You know, we're kind of hardwired to a certain extent, but it doesn't mean within that there are ways of adapting to, you know, how that space is configured and experienced from within the local context. And I know Stephen Feld, the Kaluli Feld example, yeah, the importance of sound. So how sound creates a sense of space is not something that, I mean, it does have some resonance here, you know, in our societies, and how sound is, you know, contributes to a sense of space, but not in the same way. So yeah, these questions about the multi-sensory aspects of just immersing yourself in the experiential fold and flux of these spaces is reading elements that might not first off be something you're thinking about intrinsically in spatial terms, but makes sense in terms of wider spatial anthropology or anthropology. I don't even know if that word spatial is required, because by dint of what you're doing, immersing yourself in that, even to the extent that you're having difficulties shaking off those predispositions that you mentioned, you're trying to tap into that environment in a way and learn how to think and comprehend and experience that space as others see it. And I don't know, the thing that you said about silence was interesting as well, because it's kind of an area that I've started to kind of move towards in stuff I'm doing more recently, and to coin this term dwell space, which I'm kind of running with, but just in terms of silence being something that itself opens up a sense of space that's otherwise not catered for. And I think, you know, in modern industrial societies, silence is something that's generally quite rare. And it's always needed to be filled up with something. So one of the things I'm looking at is, you know, how historically, you know, waiting at a bus stop, so up kind of non-place again, if you like, just those places of boredom, emptiness, nothing much is going on. How do you fill that time? So it's a question of time that's being passed. Now everyone would just whip out their phone. That space is being rapidly colonized by digital technology. But just the silence or the emptiness of duration, time just unfolding without the need to kind of fill it with any kind of thing. That's intriguing, and it kind of highlights the way that, you know, our spaces that we inhabit, whether they're digital spaces or any kind of space, they're assailed and assaulted on all fronts. You know, carving out a sense of space for yourself is, you know, seems to be an urgent project. I don't know if I can extrapolate more than that. That sounds a bit vague and bully, but I don't know. That probably doesn't answer your question though. So.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And there's a question here from Marja, if I pronounce your name correctly. Apologies if not. And she says, for you, what is the relationship between place and space? Do they differ? And if yes, then how? And what do you think about the notion of liminal space? Is there such a thing? Sometimes when this term is used, it seems that actually marginal and peripheral space would be more apt than liminal space. And finally, how do you think that spatial anthropology differs from human geography? There we are. You can take them one at a time if you like, these questions. So they're very good questions.
Yeah, I can't. Where am I seeing this on? Just so I can see it actually on the text.
Like
it's not on the.
Yes, it's the question above Jonathan Skinner's. No, it's in the question and answer box.
Yeah, the question has moved up because it's been upvoted.
Yeah, no, I've got it. Okay.
There we are. Excellent.
Okay, so good questions. Yeah, liminal space. Is there such a thing? Well, I mean, I would turn that on its head. Is there such a thing as non-liminal space? Which probably is not a helpful response. But yeah, the extent to which all space, by definition, is liminal in that, or you know, if allowed to be, let me put it that way, because you know, it should encompass the means of being breathable and flexible and pliable, all of these things that you would hope would be conducive to good living and creativity and people, you know, being at home in that phenomenological sense in the spaces that they dwell in. It needs to be kind of open-ended. You know, when it's fixed, it becomes like a prison or something that's very controlling or abstract. So to a certain extent, all spaces are liminal or should be. Maybe it's a should rather than they are. So how would I compare liminal space to marginal or peripheral space? Well, I think they're fundamentally different. I mean, marginal and peripheral are kind of more geographical in terms of you know, on the peripheries, you're out there, okay, you're away from the center. But liminal is encompassing more than that. I mean, quite often the term is used without really a sense, or in some cases an understanding of the anthropological origins of liminality and the importance of ritual and transformation, or that becomingness through that openness, the free play of what a liminal space or liminal experience might offer. You know, that's something, you know, far more pregnant with meaning and resonance than just something that's marginal. Marginal, to me at least, has another set of associations which don't necessarily tally with the liminal, but that's just my take as well. And yeah, how do you think spatial anthropology differs from human geography? Okay, well, this kind of yeah, I mean, the point is, I don't mean this in a dismissive kind of way, but who cares is kind of my response to that, because and I really don't mean that in a dismissive way or disrespectful way, but the extent to which any of these disciplines have to kind of put a label and strictly define some orthodox means by which, you know, human geography is set apart from, you know, something else, whatever you want to call it, or spatial anthropology. So I just reiterate what I was saying before. I'm not in the business of saying Hey everyone, look over here, spatial anthropology. This is where you need to be heading. This is the big thing that we need to be pitching our tents in. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, look, you know, there's a lot more common threads that run through these otherwise disparate areas of intellectual engagement, spatial practice. You know, let's find ways of drawing out those common threads in ways that are more productive, rather than just setting up these barriers. Go back to Jonathan's question, these barriers around disciplines where we're policing those disciplines rather than we're allowing free play of what might traffic productively across those barriers between disciplines. God, there's so many spatial metaphors flying around here. Sorry, it comes with the territory. I can't avoid it.
Well, thank you very much. Now, are there any more questions? I don't see any more in the chat. Any more from the audience at all? Anybody else would like to say something? Please feel free just to jump in if you would like to. Well, if there were no more questions, I think then we just have to thank our speaker for an extraordinarily stimulating talk. And just in case you haven't seen his book, let me put it on the screen again. Spatial Anthropology, Excursions in Liminal Space. So you can see.
Thank you for that, David.
No, not at all, not at all.
And thank you for your hospitality and allowing me to speak here. And yeah, thank you all for being here and listening and contributing to questions. Thank you very much. If you want to follow up with a question, direct me on email. I'm very happy to do that and carry on a conversation. That's fine by me.
Well, that's brilliant. And if Annie and Jessica are here, we would just like to thank you very much for your help. Perhaps you'd like to say goodbye and close the session for us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if Jessica will turn up, but thank you from my side as well. And thank you, there she is, for a last goodbye. Thank you for everybody who's still there in the audience. And we wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you, Haneen and Jessica. Thank you very much. And
Thank
David.
you, Les.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.